An 87-year-old man was connected to an EEG for seizures when his heart stopped, and instead of going quiet, his brain produced a final surge of gamma waves, the same fast rhythms linked with memory, dreaming, and conscious awareness. From that single medical accident, the science of death becomes stranger than the stories we inherited near-death memories. Terminal lucidity in dementia patients, the brain's own psychedelic chemistry, and the slow return of the body to the living world. If calm, thoughtful science journeys like this are meaningful to you, a like, a subscription, or sharing the video helps this channel continue making them with care. Thank you for spending your time watching. Leave a comment with where you're listening from, what time it is there, and whether this is playing before sleep, during study, or in a quiet moment of reflection. The first signal waits at the edge of the stopped heart. The recording begins not as an experiment about death, but as routine clinical monitoring. An elderly man in Estonia is being treated after seizures connected to an earlier brain injury, and electrodes are placed on his scalp so doctors can follow the changing electrical patterns of his brain. The device is an electroencephalogram, often called an EEG, and it does not read thoughts. It measures waves of electrical activity created by large groups of neurons working together. Under ordinary circumstances, the recording might have helped doctors understand epilepsy. Instead, the man's heart stops while the machine is still running, and by accident it captures one of the rarest medical records ever made the activity of a human brain in the moments just before and just after cardiac death. The result does not fit the simple picture many people carry. Death is often imagined as a switch, a sudden movement from activity to nothing. The heart fails, blood flow stops, oxygen no longer reaches the brain, and consciousness is assumed to vanish almost immediately. Yet in this case, the brain does not fall silent at once. Around the moment the heart stops, it shows a marked increase in several kinds of brain waves, especially gamma activity. Gamma waves are among the fastest rhythms measured in the human brain. They are associated with attention, memory processing, conscious perception, dreaming, and some forms of meditation. Their appearance in a dying brain does not prove what the man experienced, because no one could ask him afterward. It does show something more cautious and more important. The brain, at the edge of death, may enter a brief period of organized activity rather than simple collapse. That distinction matters because it changes death from an instant into a process. Once the heart stops, the brain is placed under severe stress. Neurons depend on oxygen and glucose carried by the blood. These cells use energy constantly to maintain electrical differences across their membranes, to release chemical messengers, and to keep their internal chemistry stable. When circulation fails, the energy supply begins to drop. The brain does not have a large reserve. It is a demanding organ, and even in quiet conditions it consumes a large share of the body's oxygen. A sudden stop in blood flow therefore creates an emergency within seconds. But an emergency is not the same as immediate silence. In the first moments after oxygen begins to fall, brain cells may fire in unusual patterns as the systems that normally regulate them start to lose control. Inhibitory networks, which usually keep neural activity balanced, may weaken. Electrical signals may spread with less restraint. Chemical gradients begin to fail. This unstable state can produce a burst of activity that looks, on an EEG, not like an orderly waking brain, but also not like nothing. It is a brain under extreme pressure, still signaling, still connecting, and perhaps briefly entering states that resemble those linked to vivid inner experience. The Estonian case was only one patient, and that limitation is important. The man was elderly, he had epilepsy, he had a traumatic brain injury, and he was receiving medical care under specific conditions, a single recording cannot become a universal rule for human death. It can only open a question. The question became stronger when other research began to find related patterns. Years before the Estonian recording was published, experiments in animals had shown a surge of organized brain activity after cardiac arrest. Later, researchers studying human patients near the withdrawal of life support observed gamma activity in some dying brains as well. In these cases, the patients were not expected to recover, and their brain activity was monitored as their bodies moved toward death. Not every patient showed the same pattern. That is another important caution. Death is not a single identical event in every brain. It depends on injury, illness, medications, oxygen levels, the speed of cardiac failure, and the condition of neural tissue before the final crisis begins. Still, the fact that some dying brains show brief surges of activity keeps the question open. It suggests that the final period of life may include a short and complex neurological phase that has been mostly hidden from observation. The most interesting detail in some recordings is not merely that the brain remains active, but where the activity appears. In research on dying patients, increased gamma activity has been reported in regions involved in integrating sight, sound, body position, memory, and the sense of self. One region of interest is the junction where the temporal and parietal and occipital lobes meet. This area helps combine different streams of information into a single experience. It has also been linked to unusual states such as out-of-body perception and vivid dreaming. If a dying brain activates networks involved in memory, perception, and self-awareness, then the possibility of a final inner experience becomes scientifically reasonable, even if its content remains unknown. It is not necessary to assume anything supernatural in order to see the significance. A brain losing oxygen may still produce patterns that feel structured from within. It may pull stored memories into activity. It may create a sense of movement, presence, light, or separation from the body. It may also produce fragments that never form a coherent experience at all. The data cannot show the subjective world directly. It can only show that the physical conditions for unusual experience may still exist for a short time after the body begins to fail. The idea of a life review enters here carefully. In the Estonian case, researchers noted that the kinds of waves recorded around death resemble patterns associated with memory recall. This has led to the suggestion that the brain may replay important life events near the end. The suggestion is compelling, but it must remain a possibility rather than a conclusion. Brainwaves linked to memory during life do not automatically mean that a dying person is watching a complete sequence of personal history. The same rhythms can appear in more than one kind of mental state. They may reflect memory, but they may also reflect disrupted regulation, seizure-related activity, or the brain's final attempt to maintain coherence. Scientific caution does not make the findings smaller. It makes it more exact. What can be said is that, in at least some cases, the dying brain is capable of activating rhythms and networks that are normally involved in meaningful conscious experience. That is already enough to soften the old boundary between life and death. The heart stopping is not the same as every part of the person ending at the same instant. The body enters a sequence. The brain enters its own sequence. Some cells fail quickly, others continue for a while. Some circuits may fall apart. Others may briefly flare into activity as the larger system loses stability. This helps explain why modern medicine treats death with more precision than ordinary language does. Cardiac arrest means the heart has stopped pumping effectively. Clinical death often refers to the loss of heartbeat and breathing. Brain death is different. It means the irreversible loss of all brain function, including the brainstem functions that control basic reflexes and breathing. These are related states, but they are not identical. A person can be in cardiac arrest and still be resuscitated. Brain cells can be injured by lack of oxygen, but the damage unfolds over time. The timing varies with temperature, medical intervention, and the condition of the person. This is why cardiopulmonary resuscitation, cooling, and emergency care can sometimes restore life after minutes without a normal heartbeat. The border is real, but it is not as simple as a line drawn in a single second. In that border region, the brain's activity may be shaped by both survival and breakdown. On one side is an emergency response. The brain may release chemicals that protect cells, increase arousal, or alter perception. On the other side is failure. Energy runs out. Membranes lose stability, and electrical activity can become uncontrolled. The same process may look both purposeful and chaotic depending on the level being studied. At the level of the whole brain, waves may appear coordinated. At the level of individual cells, the system may be struggling to maintain basic order. This is one reason the dying brain is so difficult to interpret. It is not simply working normally, and it is not simply inactive. It is passing through a state that ordinary waking life does not offer for comparison. That makes any strong claim risky. It also makes the evidence worth following. The final activity of the brain may be a last dream, a life review, a protective chemical event, a crisis pattern, or some combination of these. Science has not closed the question, and it may take many more recordings before the pattern becomes clear. For now, the most careful conclusion is also the most profound. Death begins biologically before it becomes absolute. In that beginning, the brain may still organize information, activate memory networks, and produce rhythms associated with conscious life. The old image of instant darkness is too simple. The first stage may be brighter, more active, and more mysterious than expected. Not because it proves what waits beyond death, but because it shows that the living brain has one final phase that medicine is only beginning to observe. The last neural fire does not answer the question of an afterlife. It narrows the question to a more precise place, inside the brief interval when the heart has stopped. Oxygen is fading, and the brain, instead of disappearing at once, sends one more pattern through the networks that once held a life. In a hospital ward, cardiac arrest is not an abstract event. It is a sudden loss of circulation, a race to restore blood flow before organs are injured beyond repair, and a situation in which the body can appear absent from ordinary life while medical work continues around it. This is the setting in which many near-death reports begin. A person has no effective heartbeat. Breathing may have stopped or become inadequate. Blood is no longer carrying oxygen to the brain in the normal way. From the outside, the case belongs to emergency medicine. From the inside, according to some survivors, something else occurs as well. They later describe awareness, memory, unusual calm, or the sense of observing events from a position outside the body. These accounts are not all alike, and they should not be treated as proof of a single explanation. Some are brief and fragmentary. Some may be shaped by expectation, culture, medication, oxygen deprivation, or the confusion of recovery. But a smaller group of reports is difficult to dismiss, because the memories are organized and, in some cases, appear to contain details that match the medical scene. That is the narrow scientific problem. The question is not whether people tell these stories sincerely. Many clearly do. The question is how any structured experience can occur when the brain is under the extreme conditions of cardiac arrest. One of the most ambitious attempts to study this question was the Awareness During Resuscitation project, led by physician and resuscitation researcher Sam Parnia and colleagues. The aim was not to prove an afterlife. It was to examine what people remember after cardiac arrest, and whether any reported awareness could be compared with events in the room. This distinction matters. A scientific study does not begin by accepting the meaning of the experience. It begins by asking what can be documented. The project followed cardiac arrest patients across hospitals and later interviewed survivors who were well enough to speak. Only a small fraction of patients survived and recovered sufficiently to give detailed accounts, which is one reason this area of research remains difficult. Cardiac arrest is medically severe. Memory after intensive care can be incomplete. Sedatives, pain, shock, and later reconstruction can all influence what a survivor recalls. Even so, some patients described a period of awareness during the time when they were considered clinically dead. Others described feelings rather than scenes: peacefulness, separation from pain, a sense of moving toward light, or contact with deceased relatives. The reports were not random in the way delirium is often random. They often had sequence, structure, and emotional coherence. A later phase of the research added brain monitoring during resuscitation in some cases, bringing the study closer to the central question. If the brain can show organized activity during or after cardiac arrest, then near-death memories may not require a complete break from neuroscience. They may arise from a brain under extraordinary stress, sometimes silent at the surface, sometimes partially recovering, sometimes producing signals that are hard to detect with ordinary clinical tools. The difficulty is timing. A survivor may report an experience that seems to have occurred while the heart was stopped, but the exact moment of experience is hard to establish. It could have happened just before circulation failed, during brief restoration of blood flow, or during early recovery as consciousness returned. The brain may compress memory, reorder events, or create a sense of duration that does not match clock time. These limitations do not erase the reports. They define the care needed in interpreting them. The most striking cases are those involving apparent perception of the medical environment. A patient may describe hearing a machine, seeing staff working nearby, or observing actions taken during resuscitation. When details can be checked and found to be consistent with the medical record, the case becomes more challenging. The simplest explanation is that the patient perceived something through ordinary senses before losing consciousness, or while partially recovering, then later placed the memory inside the period of death. Another possibility is that some low level of auditory processing or awareness continues longer than expected during cardiac arrest, even without normal responsiveness. Hearing can persist in unusual states, and the brain may register sounds without forming ordinary waking consciousness. A third possibility is that residual or returning brain activity, supported by chest compressions during cardiopulmonary resuscitation, allows moments of perception even when the patient appears unresponsive. None of these explanations is complete in every case, but each is scientifically plausible. What remains difficult is the combination of accurate detail, reported separation from the body, and the medical assumption that consciousness should have been absent. The term out-of-body experience can sound supernatural, but neuroscience treats it first as a disturbance in body representation. The brain normally builds a stable sense of being located inside the body by combining vision, touch, balance, proprioception, and internal signals from organs. When those systems become unstable, the sense of location can change. The junction of the temporal and parietal regions has been especially important in this work, because stimulation or disruption there can produce the feeling of floating, rising, or seeing the body from outside. This does not mean every near-death out-of-body report is explained. It means the brain has known mechanisms for altering the perceived position of the self. During cardiac arrest, low oxygen disrupted blood flow. Stress chemicals and loss of normal sensory input could push those mechanisms into unfamiliar states. The person may no longer feel anchored to the body because the brain systems that maintain that anchor are failing or reorganizing. The result can be experienced not as confusion, but as clarity. Many survivors say the experience felt sharper than ordinary life. That claim is important because it does not match the common idea of a weak hallucination. Yet vividness alone cannot prove an external reality. Dreams can be vivid, psychedelic states can be vivid, temporal lobe seizures can be vivid. The scientific task is to ask why the dying or recovering brain can generate experiences with such intensity, and why those experiences so often share similar features. One recurring feature is the life review. Survivors describe memories returning not as ordinary remembering, but as an immersive review of actions, relationships, and emotional consequences. Some report feeling the effects of their behavior on other people. The content may feel moral without necessarily being tied to a particular religion. From a brain-based perspective, this could involve large-scale memory activation under conditions of disinhibition, when the usual filters of attention and self-protection are weakened. Memory is not stored in one place. It is distributed across networks that include sensory regions, emotional circuits, and areas involved in autobiographical meaning. If those networks are briefly activated together, the result might feel like a whole life arriving at once. From a human perspective, this is why the reports carry such weight. They are not merely visual scenes. They often change how survivors understand their relationships, fears, and priorities. Many become less afraid of death. Some become more reflective, less focused on status or possessions, and more affected by the emotional consequences of their actions. Those changes do not prove what happened, but they show that the experience can have lasting psychological force. A hallucination, if that is what it is, can still be transformative. A real perception, if that is what some cases contain, would raise even harder questions. The careful position is to leave both the experience and the explanation open, while staying close to what is known. Cardiac arrest does not instantly erase every process in the brain. Resuscitation can provide partial blood flow. Brain activity can return in stages. Memory can form in unusual ways around loss and recovery of consciousness. At the same time, some near-death reports are more structured, calm, and externally detailed than older models predicted. They do not allow an easy conclusion. They show that human awareness near death is not well understood, and that the old assumption of immediate inner emptiness is too simple. The people who come back do not bring measurements from another world. They bring memories formed at the border of physiology, crisis, and meaning. Those memories may be produced by the brain, received by the brain, or shaped by processes not yet described clearly enough. Science can study the timing, the neural activity, the medical conditions, and the reliability of specific claims. It cannot yet say why some minds, under the threat of extinction, report peace, review, separation, and a sense of continuing beyond the body. The evidence does not close the question of what happens after death. It makes the question more exact. Whatever near-death experiences are, they occur close to one of the most extreme states a human brain can enter and still return from. Where circulation fails, ordinary responsiveness disappears, and yet some survivors later describe a period that feels not empty, but deeply organized. Dimethyltryptamine is a small molecule with an unusually large place in the science of altered consciousness. It belongs to a family of compounds called tryptamines, chemicals whose structure resembles serotonin, one of the brain's major signaling molecules. In the laboratory, dimethyltryptamine can produce a rapid and powerful change in experience. When it enters the bloodstream in an active form, perception can shift within seconds. Ordinary boundaries of the self may weaken. Visual imagery can become intense. Time may feel changed. Some people report a sense of leaving the body, entering a different space, meeting presences, or encountering a reality that seems more convincing than ordinary waking life. These reports sound close to many near-death experiences, and that similarity has made dimethyltryptamine one of the most discussed candidates for explaining what the dying brain might generate. The idea is not that this molecule proves an afterlife, and not that it explains every account from survivors of cardiac arrest. The question is more limited and more useful. If the brain can produce dimethyltryptamine naturally, and if the molecule can create experiences that resemble near-death states, then it may be one part of the biological process that unfolds when the brain is under extreme stress. For a long time, that possibility was surrounded by speculation. The brain was known to contain the chemical ingredients and enzymes that might allow the formation of dimethyltryptamine, but the evidence was incomplete. It was easy to turn the molecule into a dramatic story before the measurements were strong enough to support one. A popular hypothesis placed the source in the pineal gland, a small structure near the center of the brain that helps regulate sleep by producing melatonin. Because the pineal gland has carried symbolic importance in older philosophical and spiritual traditions, the idea attracted attention quickly. But attention is not evidence. The pineal gland is small, and producing enough dimethyltryptamine to create a strong psychedelic state would require a rapid and substantial release. Many scientists doubted that such an event was likely, especially because dimethyltryptamine is broken down quickly by enzymes in the body. This criticism remains important. Even if the brain makes the molecule, the amount, location, timing, and duration all matter, a trace amount in tissue is not the same as a full experience. A chemical possibility is not the same as a confirmed mechanism. The discussion changed when researchers began looking beyond the pineal gland alone. In work published in the late 2010s, a team studying mammalian brains found evidence that the machinery needed to synthesize dimethyltryptamine was not confined to one tiny structure. Enzymes involved in its production appeared in several brain regions, including areas of the cortex, in animal studies. Researchers also measured dimethyltryptamine directly in the living brain. The molecule was not merely an imagined product. It was present in measurable amounts. Most strikingly, when cardiac arrest was induced in rats, levels of dimethyltryptamine rose in the visual cortex. The result did not prove that human beings flood their brains with the molecule at death, and it did not show that dimethyltryptamine causes near-death experiences. It did show that a dying mammalian brain can increase production of a substance known to alter perception profoundly. That is a serious finding, because it moves the discussion from mythology into physiology. It suggests that the brain may have chemical responses to the approach of death that are only beginning to be mapped. These responses may be part of a wider emergency program rather than a single dramatic release. When oxygen falls and cells become stressed, the brain changes its electrical activity, its chemistry, and its balance of inhibition and excitation. Dimethyltryptamine, if released during this period, would not act in isolation. It would enter a brain already disturbed by low oxygen, changing blood flow, stress hormones, shifting neurotransmitters, and failing energy systems. The experience that might result from such a state would be shaped by many processes at once. This matters because it avoids a simple explanation. The dying brain is not likely to have one switch that produces the tunnel, the light, the life review, and the sense of leaving the body. It is more likely that several systems become unstable or unusually active together. Visual networks may generate light and pattern. Body mapping networks may loosen the sense of physical location. Memory networks may become disinhibited. Emotional circuits may produce peace, fear, awe, or recognition. Dimethyltryptamine could amplify some of these changes, especially those involving perception and the boundaries of the self. It may be one chemical contributor within a larger event. The comparison between dimethyltryptamine experiences and near-death experiences has been tested more directly in human volunteers. In controlled studies, people given the molecule completed questionnaires designed to measure the features often reported after near-death states. The overlap was strong. Volunteers described altered time, a sense of crossing into another domain, powerful emotion, separation from the ordinary self, and encounters that felt meaningful. These features resemble reports from people resuscitated after cardiac arrest. Still, resemblance is not identity. A drug experience occurs in a living brain with circulation, oxygen, and a controlled dose. A near-death experience occurs around a medical crisis, often with injury, fear, interrupted blood flow, and later recovery. The two states may share pathways without being the same event. The value of the comparison is that it shows the brain can generate near-death-like experiences through known chemistry. It does not show that all near-death experiences are only chemistry, and it does not remove the puzzle of verified perceptions or the timing of awareness during cardiac arrest. It simply gives science a clearer mechanism to examine. A second question is why the brain would produce dimethyltryptamine at all. One answer is that it may not exist only to create unusual experiences. Some research suggests that dimethyltryptamine interacts with cellular systems involved in stress response, inflammation, and protection of neurons. In that view, the molecule may be part of the brain's attempt to defend itself under extreme conditions. It may help cells survive injury or adapt to sudden stress. If that is true, the vivid inner experience may be a side effect of a protective biological process. The brain, facing oxygen loss, might release chemicals that support cell survival while also changing consciousness in profound ways. This would fit with a broader pattern in biology. Many molecules have more than one function. A chemical that protects cells can also alter perception. A system designed for survival can produce states that feel spiritual, not because the system was built to create theology, but because the experience of a human brain under pressure is interpreted through memory, culture, and meaning. The same internal event can be described in medical language, psychological language, or religious language depending on the person and the society around them. This does not make the experience false. It shows how biology and interpretation meet. There is also a need for restraint. The claim that the brain releases enough dimethyltryptamine at death to create a full visionary state has not been proven in humans. Directly measuring the molecule in a dying human brain would be extraordinarily difficult. Medically and ethically, animal results are valuable, but they do not transfer perfectly to human death. The concentrations required for a strong psychedelic experience are still debated. The molecule is broken down quickly. The timing of release may be too brief, or it may occur in specific brain regions rather than across the whole cortex. These uncertainties are not minor details. They are the difference between an attractive idea and a demonstrated explanation. A careful scientific account must hold both sides at once. The brain can make dimethyltryptamine. The molecule can produce experiences similar to near-death reports. Animal studies suggest its levels can rise during cardiac arrest, but the role it plays in human dying remains unresolved. That unresolved status is not a weakness in the story. It is the honest center of it. Dimethyltryptamine is important because it gives the mystery a testable form. Instead of asking only whether death opens a door beyond the body, science can ask what chemicals appear in the brain, where they appear, when they rise, how they affect neural networks, and whether they match the memories survivors describe. The molecule does not settle the question of what happens after death. It makes the final moments of the brain more active, more biological, and more complex than the older image of simple shutdown allowed. If near-death experiences are partly chemical, they are still among the most meaningful chemical events a person can undergo. If they are more than chemical, then chemistry may still be the way the brain participates in the threshold. Either way, dimethyltryptamine points to the same careful conclusion reached by the electrical recordings of the dying brain. The end of life is not only a loss of function, it is also a change of state. And within that change, the brain may release molecules capable of turning its last crisis into an experience of unusual clarity, intensity, and depth. Terminal lucidity begins with a contradiction that medicine still has not fully explained. A person with advanced dementia may spend months or years unable to recognize family members, unable to speak in full sentences, unable to remember where they are, and unable to carry out familiar actions that once felt ordinary. The disease has not merely hidden these abilities behind tiredness or confusion. In many cases, the brain has been physically altered by years of damage. Tissue has shrunk. Connections have weakened. The hippocampus, which is central to forming and retrieving memory, may be severely affected. The cortex, which supports language, judgment, and the continuity of personal identity, may also be deeply impaired. Yet in the hours or days before death, some patients suddenly become clear. They may speak after a long silence. They may recognize a son or daughter whose face had seemed unfamiliar for years. They may call someone by name, recall an old event, sing a song, offer a farewell, or show a focused emotional presence that family members thought had disappeared permanently. The episode may last only a few seconds, or it may last long enough for a conversation. Then the person usually declines again and dies soon afterward. The event is called terminal lucidity, and it is one of the most difficult subjects in the study of dying, because it sits at the meeting point of neurology, caregiving, grief, and the meaning of the self. The word terminal is used because the clarity often appears near the end of life. The word lucidity means that the person shows a level of awareness or mental organization that is unexpected given the known condition of the brain. In dementia care, families sometimes describe such moments cautiously because they fear they may have imagined them. Nurses, hospice workers, and physicians have reported them as well. The pattern is not limited to Alzheimer's disease, although Alzheimer's is the most familiar setting. Similar episodes have been described in people with other forms of dementia, brain tumours, stroke, and other conditions that greatly reduced ordinary communication. What makes the phenomenon important is not that a patient becomes slightly more alert. Small fluctuations are common in illness. People with dementia can have better and worse periods during the day. Infection, medication, sleep, dehydration, pain, and environment can all change awareness. Terminal lucidity is different because the return can be sudden, meaningful, and far beyond what caregivers expect. A patient who had not spoken coherently may produce complete sentences. A person who seemed unable to recognize anyone may show precise recognition. A damaged mind appears to gather itself one last time. The first explanation must remain biological. A mysterious event is not automatically evidence that consciousness exists outside the brain. The brain is complex enough that unusual recoveries of function may occur without requiring a non-physical cause. One possibility is that terminal lucidity reflects a temporary change in brain networks. Even in advanced dementia, not every neuron is destroyed, and not every memory trace may be lost in the same way. Some pathways may be damaged but not gone. Others may be inactive because the larger network around them has become disorganized. Near death, the brain enters a changing chemical and electrical state. Oxygen levels shift, inflammation changes, stress hormones rise, inhibitory systems may weaken. This loss of inhibition could briefly allow activity to pass through circuits that were previously blocked. the result might be a short restoration of access, not because the disease has been reversed, but because the failing brain has changed its operating conditions. Another possibility involves network compensation. The brain is not a machine with one pathway for each memory or word. It is a living system with overlapping routes. When one area is damaged, other areas may sometimes support part of the lost function. In ordinary dementia, that compensation may be too weak or unstable to show clearly. In the final phase of life, a surge of arousal or altered chemistry could temporarily strengthen remaining pathways. A patient might then retrieve a familiar name, a personal memory, or a phrase connected to deep emotional meaning. This would not require the full restoration of the brain. It would require a brief alignment of surviving networks. Some researchers also consider whether chemical changes near death might promote short bursts of plasticity, the brain's ability to adjust connections. Molecules involved in stress response and cell survival may become active as the body fails. Earlier discussions of the dying brain raise the possibility that substances such as dimethyltryptamine may increase under extreme conditions, at least in animal studies. If similar chemical changes occur in human dying, they might influence perception, memory, and connectivity. This remains speculative, especially in relation to terminal lucidity. The evidence is not strong enough to say that one molecule causes the return of clarity. Still, it is reasonable to ask whether the same emergency chemistry that alters near-death experience might also affect damaged brains close to death. The difficulty is that terminal lucidity often occurs in conditions where ordinary explanation seems strained. Alzheimer's disease is not only a temporary disruption of attention, it is a progressive neurodegenerative illness. Abnormal proteins accumulate, synapses fail, neurons die. Brain regions essential for memory and language can lose volume over many years. If a person suddenly speaks clearly after years of silence, the question becomes precise. Was the knowledge still stored somewhere, but inaccessible? Were the circuits that expressed it damaged but not destroyed? These questions do not have settled answers. They matter because they touch the deepest assumption in neuroscience that the person is fully produced by the working brain. If severe brain damage can hide a mind that later reappears briefly, then damage may sometimes block expression more than it erases identity. That would not mean the brain is only a receiver, and it would not prove that consciousness survives death. It would mean that the relationship between brain structure and personal presence is more complicated than a simple one-to-one map. A person may be unavailable to the outside world because speech, attention, and recognition systems are failing, while some aspects of memory and self remain partly preserved in forms that are difficult to detect. For families, this distinction is not abstract. A lucid moment can change the emotional meaning of a long illness. Dementia often creates a slow grief before death, because the person seems to disappear in stages while the body remains alive. Terminal lucidity can interrupt that grief with a final contact. A parent may recognize a child. A spouse may respond with affection. Someone who had seemed unreachable may return just long enough to say goodbye. These moments can bring comfort, but they can also bring confusion, because they raise hope immediately before loss. A family may wonder why the clarity could not last, or whether the person had been aware all along but unable to communicate. Science cannot yet answer that fully. It can only say that awareness in severe dementia may be more variable than behavior alone suggests, and that end-of-life care should leave room for the possibility of meaningful contact even when recovery is not expected. The study of terminal lucidity is difficult because the episodes are brief and unpredictable. Most occur in homes, nursing facilities, or hospice settings, not in laboratories. By the time researchers hear about them, the patient has often died, and the account depends on memory from caregivers or family members. prospective studies which observe patients before episodes occur are needed but hard to conduct. Researchers must define what counts as lucidity, measure the patient's baseline condition, record the episode if it happens, and connect it with brain activity or medical changes. This is beginning to happen, but the field remains young. The work requires caution, not only because the science is incomplete, but because the subject is emotionally charged. A weak report should not be treated as proof. A strong report should not be ignored because it is uncomfortable. The correct approach is patient documentation. What was the person able to do before the episode? What changed during it? How long did it last? What medications, infections, oxygen levels, or metabolic shifts were present? Careful questions turn a moving story into data without removing its human value. In the larger study of what happens after death, terminal lucidity plays a special role. It does not describe visions beyond the body. It does not describe tunnels, lights, or a life review. It stays inside the room, in the face and voice of a person whose brain should not be able to recover so much so quickly. That makes it quieter than near-death experience, but no less important. It suggests that the end of life can temporarily reorganize the damaged brain in ways that are not yet understood. It also suggests that identity may be harder to measure than memory tests or scans alone can show. The final clarity may be a biological flare from surviving circuits. It may be a brief release from inhibition. It may be an emotional memory system finding one last path into speech. It may be something current neuroscience has not yet named. The evidence does not allow a final answer. It leaves a careful question at the center of the dying process. If a mind that seemed lost can return for a moment before silence, then death is not only the failure of systems, it is also a period in which hidden capacities may briefly become visible, showing that the boundary between absence and presence is more delicate than it appears. The physical changes after death begin with a simple interruption. The heart no longer moves blood through the vessels, and without that movement, oxygen and nutrients stop reaching tissues that have depended on constant supply for a lifetime. This does not mean every cell dies at the same moment. The body is a collection of tissues with different needs, different tolerances, and different rates of failure. Brain cells are among the most vulnerable because they require steady oxygen to maintain their electrical and chemical balance. Skin, bone, and some immune cells can remain viable longer. Forensic science studies this uneven transition because the body records time in chemical and physical changes. Those records are affected by temperature, humidity, clothing, injury, body size, burial conditions, insects, and many other factors. Still, the broad sequence is clear enough to show that biological death is not only an ending, it is a process of breakdown, transfer, and return. The first visible changes are quiet. As circulation stops, blood no longer fills the smallest vessels near the surface in the usual way. The skin may become pale as the colour supported by moving blood fades. This early pallor can appear within minutes, though it is easier to see in lighter skin and may be subtle in other cases. Cooling also begins. During life, the body produces heat through metabolism, the continuous chemical work of cells. After death, that heat production falls, and the body slowly approaches the temperature of its surroundings. This cooling is called algor mortis. It is often described in simple rates, but real bodies do not cool with perfect regularity. A body in a cold room loses heat differently from one outdoors in warm air. Clothing and body fat slow the process. Water can draw heat away faster than air. A forensic investigator therefore treats temperature as one clue among several, not as a clock that can be read without context. As blood settles under gravity, another change appears. This is livor mortis, the pooling of blood in the lowest parts of the body. Once the heart is no longer pushing blood forward, red blood cells sink through the vessels and collect in dependent tissues. The skin in those areas may develop a purplish or reddish discoloration. Areas pressed against a surface may remain lighter because pressure prevents blood from settling there. In forensic work, this pattern can help suggest the position of the body after death, and sometimes whether the body was moved. Even here, caution is needed. Livor mortis develops over time and can be affected by blood loss, temperature, and the cause of death. The body is giving evidence, but the evidence must be interpreted carefully. A later change is rigor mortis, the temporary stiffening of muscles. Muscles move because proteins inside muscle fibers bind, pull, release, and reset. That release requires adenosine triphosphate. The main energy molecule used by cells. After death, cells can no longer replenish this energy in the normal way. As it runs down, the muscle proteins remain locked together and stiffness develops. It usually begins in smaller muscles and spreads through larger groups, though timing varies widely. Eventually the stiffness fades, not because life returns, but because decomposition breaks down the muscle proteins themselves. What looks like a final pose is actually a consequence of molecular depletion. Beneath these visible signs, a deeper process is already underway. Cells contain enzymes that normally perform useful work. They digest nutrients, recycle damaged parts, and help maintain life. After death, cellular membranes lose integrity. The compartments that kept enzymes separated begin to fail. The enzymes leak into surrounding tissue and start breaking down the cells that once contained them. This self-digestion is called autolysis. Organs rich in enzymes and water tend to change quickly. The pancreas, liver, and brain can break down early because their tissues are soft and chemically active. The skin and connective tissues may hold structure longer. Again, the body does not decompose evenly. It changes as a set of tissues, each following its own chemistry. The next major force comes from microbes. During life, the human body contains enormous communities of bacteria, fungi, and other microorganisms, especially in the gut. They help digest food, shape immunity, and occupy spaces that might otherwise be taken by harmful organisms. They are part of the living body's normal ecology. After death, the immune system no longer maintains boundaries. The lining of the intestine weakens. Microbes spread into nearby tissues and blood vessels. They consume available nutrients and produce gases and chemical byproducts. This microbial activity contributes to bloating, odor, color change, and the softening of organs. It can seem disturbing when described plainly, but it is also ordinary biology. The organisms are not acting with intent. They are continuing metabolism in an environment that has changed. The same microbial processes that recycle fallen animals, leaves, and other organic matter now act on a human body. Insects may join the process when a body is accessible. Blowflies and other species can detect chemical signs of decomposition and may arrive quickly in suitable conditions. They lay eggs in moist openings or wounds, and the larvae feed on soft tissue. Forensic entomology, the study of insects in legal investigations, uses insect life cycles to help estimate time since death. The method depends on temperature and species identification, because insect growth changes with environmental conditions. In warm weather, insect activity can greatly accelerate the loss of soft tissue. In cold, dry, sealed, buried, or underwater settings, the sequence can be delayed or altered. Some bodies become skeletonized in a relatively short period. Others are preserved for years or centuries through freezing, drying, low oxygen, acidity, or deliberate treatment. The body's after-death path is therefore not one path, but many possible paths shaped by place. However it proceeds, decomposition returns matter to circulation in the environment. Proteins break into amino acids, fats split into smaller molecules, carbohydrates are consumed, minerals remain in bone and then slowly enter soil or water as the skeleton weathers. Carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, calcium, iron, and many other elements move from the body into microbes, insects, plants, and sediments. This is not symbolic continuation, it is chemical transfer. A body becomes part of local nutrient cycles. The area beneath and around it can become enriched because decomposition releases concentrated organic material into the soil. Microbial communities shift, plant growth may change in natural ecosystems. The death of an animal creates a temporary pulse of resources used by scavengers, insects, fungi, bacteria, and plants. Human bodies follow the same underlying rules, although culture often modifies the process through burial, cremation, embalming, mummification, or newer forms of body disposition. These choices affect how quickly and by what route the body returns its materials. Embalming slows microbial change by using chemicals that preserve tissue for viewing and transport. Sealed coffins and vaults can reduce contact with soil, but do not create permanence. Cremation returns much of the body to the atmosphere as gases and leaves mineral remains from bone. Green burial places the body in closer contact with soil, allowing decomposition to proceed with fewer barriers. Human composting, where permitted, manages temperature, moisture, and plant material to transform remains into soil-like material over a controlled period. Each practice carries cultural, practical, emotional, and environmental meanings. Science can describe the physical effects, but it does not decide which meaning a community should give them. At the larger scale, the body's elements have a history older than the body itself. Hydrogen formed early in the universe. Carbon, oxygen, calcium, and iron were produced through stellar processes and distributed through space before becoming part of Earth, through food, water, and air. Those atoms entered a living person and spent a period arranged as cells, blood, bone, and nervous tissue. After death, the arrangement dissolves, the atoms remain. They may enter soil microbes, a plant root, groundwater, an insect, or the atmosphere. Over long periods, they may move through many living and non-living systems. This material continuity is the most direct afterlife biology can demonstrate. It does not answer whether consciousness continues, and it does not replace the emotional meaning of a person's life. It simply shows that the body is not removed from nature when life ends. It becomes available to other processes. The person's memories, relationships, and awareness may be gone from the measurable body, but the matter that supported them continues through the physical world. This is a clear boundary between what science can say and what it cannot. Science can describe cooling, blood settling, muscle stiffening, cellular self-digestion, microbial decomposition, insect succession, and nutrient cycling. It can measure gases, tissues, temperatures, and soil chemistry. It can explain how the body returns to surrounding systems. It cannot determine from decomposition alone what becomes of subjective experience. The body after death is honest evidence of biology, but it is silent about the inner question that has followed human beings for as long as they have buried their dead. That silence is part of why cultures created rituals, tombs, prayers, maps, and doctrines around death. The physical body showed decay. The human mind asked whether something more than the body had departed. The next movement in this story begins there, not with a scanner or a forensic table, but with a civilization that tried to organize death into a journey, a judgment, and a form of continued existence. The ancient Egyptian afterlife begins with a practical concern rather than an abstract belief. The dead person must be prepared, preserved, named, supplied, guided, and judged. This civilization built a detailed system around the idea that the person continued in several parts, and that those parts required care after the body stopped living. The body mattered because it gave the spirit a stable place to return. The tomb mattered because it held offerings and protected the name. The written spells mattered because the dead were thought to face obstacles that required knowledge. Ancient Egypt developed one of the most organized models of death in human history, and at its center was a claim that still feels familiar in reports from people who have come close to dying. A life is not only remembered at death, it is evaluated. The heart is not only a piece of tissue, it becomes the record of a person's choices. That record must be weighed. And the result determines whether the person continues or disappears. To understand why this mattered, it helps to begin with how Egyptians understood the human being. A person was not seen as a single indivisible unit. The body was one part, the name was another, because a name preserved identity across time. The ka was the vital force, the life energy associated with nourishment and continuation. The ba was the mobile aspect of personality, often shown as a bird with a human head, able to move between the tomb and the world beyond. The ak was the transformed state that the dead hoped to become, an effective and enduring being able to exist with the gods. These terms do not match modern anatomy or psychology, yet they show a careful attempt to separate the functions that death seems to divide. There is the body left behind. There is the remembered person. There is the continuing presence felt by the living. There is the hope that identity can be reorganized into a durable form. This system made preservation essential. Mummification was not only a custom of display or status, it supported the belief that the dead still needed a body connected to identity. If the body decayed beyond recognition, the relationship between the person's parts could be threatened. That is why care for the corpse, the tomb, and the name became religious acts. The journey after death led through the duat, the Egyptian underworld. The duat was not simply a place of punishment. It was a region of passage, danger, transformation, and testing. The dead might encounter gates, guardians, questions, and beings that had to be named correctly. Knowledge was protective. Words had power because the correct words allowed movement through a difficult landscape. The collection now known as the Book of the Dead was part of this system. Its older Egyptian title referred to going forth by day, a phrase that expressed the hope that the dead could emerge into a renewed form of life. The text was not one fixed book owned by everyone in the same way. It was a set of spells, instructions, hymns, and images drawn from a long tradition, with different copies containing different selections. Some were written on papyrus and placed in tombs. Some were richly illustrated. Some were more modest. The purpose was consistent even when the copies varied. The dead were being equipped for a process that required memory, speech, recognition, and moral standing. In this sense, the Book of the Dead is not only a religious artifact, it is also evidence of how one culture tried to make death navigable. The most famous scene comes near the final judgment. The dead person enters the hall of Ma'at, the principle of truth, order, balance, and right relationship. This is not only legal judgment in the ordinary sense, it is a test of whether the person's life has aligned with the structure that Egyptians believed kept the world coherent. Osiris presides as Lord of the Dead. Anubis is associated with guiding and preparing the dead, and with the weighing itself. Thoth records the result. Divine judges are present. The exact images vary across sources and tombs, but the central action is stable. The heart of the deceased is placed on a scale and weighed against the feather of Ma'at. The heart was treated as the seat of thought, feeling, intention, and memory. It carried the evidence of the life lived. If the heart balanced with the feather, the person was declared justified and could continue into the blessed afterlife. If the heart was too heavy with wrongdoing, it was destroyed by Amit, a being combining features of several feared animals. The result was not eternal correction or a temporary sentence. It was annihilation, the second death, the loss of continued existence. This is a severe idea, but it is also a precise one. The final danger is not pain. It is erasure. The person's continuity depends on the moral weight of the life. The negative confessions belong to the same pattern. The deceased denies having committed a series of wrongs before the divine court. These statements include social, ritual, and ethical failures, and their range shows that Egyptian morality was not only about private feeling, it involved harm, theft, dishonesty, disorder, and neglect of obligations. Whether every confession represented literal autobiography is less important than the function of the scene. The dead person stands before a complete record. Nothing can be revised once the heart is on the scale. This idea has a strong psychological force. It treats memory and morality as inseparable. A life is not measured by a single belief or by a final statement alone, but by the accumulated pattern of actions. The heart has become the archive. In modern scientific terms, the heart does not store autobiographical memory. Memory depends on networks across the brain. Yet the Egyptian image still captures something human beings repeatedly report near death, the sense of facing the whole life at once, not as a list of dates, but as a moral and emotional totality. The comparison with near-death life review must be made carefully. Ancient Egyptian texts do not prove that people in the ancient world had the same experiences described by modern cardiac arrest survivors. Modern reports do not prove that the Egyptian afterlife is physically real. The value of the comparison is structural. In both cases, death is associated with review, judgment, and the emotional consequence of actions. Modern survivors sometimes describe reliving moments from their lives while sensing how their behavior affected other people. Egyptian tradition places the heart, the symbol of inner record and moral identity, against a feather representing truth and balance. These are not identical systems. One is a reported experience from a medical crisis. The other is a religious and cultural map developed over centuries. Still, both suggest that human beings expect death to reveal the meaning of a life more clearly than ordinary life does. From a scientific point of view, such a pattern may arise because the brain is built to organize selfhood through memory, emotion, and social consequence. Human beings remember themselves through relationships. Guilt, gratitude, shame, tenderness, regret, and forgiveness are not extra decorations added to memory. They are part of how memory is stored and retrieved. When the brain is under extreme stress, as in near-death states, autobiographical networks may activate in ways that bring emotional meaning forward. Ancient cultures, without brain scanners or resuscitation science, may have shaped similar human intuitions into symbolic systems. They observed dying, grief, dreams, altered states, and the continuing presence of the dead in memory. From those observations, they built a map in which the heart tells the truth of the person. The field of reeds, the blessed destination after successful judgment, also deserves attention because it was not a completely unfamiliar paradise. It resembled an ideal Egypt fertile land, water, harvest, order, family, and continuity. The afterlife did not erase the known world, it perfected it. This is a common feature in many traditions. The hoped-for life after death often preserves what a culture values most, while removing hunger, disorder, illness, and threat. For Egyptians living beside the Nile, a stable field, reliable water, and successful crops represented survival and cosmic order. The reward after death was therefore not escape into abstraction. It was participation in a world made right. Against this stands the fear of non-existence, the failure to pass, the loss of the name and the self. Between those outcomes is the scale. That is why the weighing of the heart remains so powerful. It turns the question of death away from curiosity about where the dead go and toward a quieter question about what kind of life can endure judgment. Science cannot confirm the scale, the feather, or the divine court. It can explain the heart as an organ and memory as a function of the brain. It can compare ancient narratives with modern reports of life review and identify recurring themes. What it cannot do is remove the human need that produced the scene. At the threshold of death, people ask whether identity continues, whether actions matter, and whether the hidden record of a life becomes clear. Ancient Egypt answered with preservation, passage, and judgment. It is the pressure to believe that a life has shape, that memory has weight, and that death may reveal the pattern that daily living leaves unfinished. The Tibetan Bardo tradition approaches death from a different direction than ancient Egypt. It does not begin with a scale, a preserved body, or a moral court. It begins with consciousness itself, and with the claim that the mind, when separated from ordinary life, may pass through states that are vivid, unstable, and easily misunderstood. The best-known text connected with this tradition is often called the Tibetan Book of the Dead in English, though its Tibetan title is more accurately understood as a teaching on liberation through hearing during the intermediate state. The word bardo means an interval or in-between condition. In Tibetan Buddhist thought, life is filled with bardos, the waking state, the dream state, meditation, dying, the period after death, and the movement toward rebirth. The after-death bardo is therefore not treated as a simple location. It is a sequence of experience in which the mind encounters its own nature, its fears, its attachments, and its habits. This is what makes the text so unusual when compared with many other afterlife maps. The beings, lights, sounds, and visions that appear are not only external figures in a distant world, they are also understood as expressions of the mind itself. The central problem is recognition. If consciousness recognizes what is happening, liberation is possible. If it mistakes its own projections for solid reality, it is drawn onward by fear, desire, and confusion. The tradition describes the dying process in stages. First, the ordinary supports of life weaken, the senses fade, the body loses strength, breath changes, awareness becomes less anchored to sight, sound, touch, and the familiar position of the body. Tibetan descriptions speak of elements dissolving, earth into water, water into fire, fire into air, and air into consciousness. These elements should not be read as modern chemistry. They are a way of describing the felt collapse of bodily stability, fluidity, warmth, movement, and ordinary awareness. In scientific language, the dying brain is losing the steady input and regulation that maintain normal experience. Blood pressure may fall, oxygen delivery may decline, networks involved in body sense, memory, attention, and perception may become unstable. The Bardo teaching uses a different vocabulary, but it is attentive to the same broad fact the usual structure of experience comes apart. Where modern medicine measures pulse, breathing, and electrical signals, the text describes changes in appearance, sensation, and consciousness. The overlap is not proof that the Tibetan tradition is a neuroscience manual. It shows that careful observers of dying, meditation, and altered states developed a detailed language for transitions that modern science is only beginning to examine in another way. After the final breath, the text gives special importance to a clear, luminous state. This is sometimes described as the clear light in Buddhist terms. It points toward the fundamental nature of mind. Free from ordinary grasping and confusion, the person who recognizes it can be liberated. The person who fails to recognize it moves into further visionary states. From a scientific perspective, there is no way to test the clear light as a post-mortem reality. It lies beyond the reach of instruments if the brain has permanently ceased functioning. Yet the idea has a meaningful relation to experiences reported near death and in deep meditation. People sometimes describe intense brightness, peace, loss of ordinary self-boundaries, and a sense that awareness has become more open than usual. Such experiences may be produced by brain states involving visual networks, reduced bodily self-modeling, altered neurotransmission, and changes in attention. They may also be interpreted within spiritual systems as contact with a deeper level of reality. The scientific account and the religious interpretation do not need to be forced into one claim. They are describing the same class of human experience from different commitments. Science asks what the nervous system is doing when such reports occur. Tibetan Buddhism asks whether the experience can be recognized without clinging to it. As the bardo unfolds, the text describes peaceful and wrathful appearances. Peaceful deities may appear first, often with bright lights and ordered forms. Later, fierce and frightening forms may arise, with intense sounds, threatening shapes, and overwhelming force. In the tradition, both peaceful and wrathful appearances are still expressions of mind. Fear makes them seem dangerous. Recognition reveals them as empty of independent threat. This is one of the most psychologically sophisticated parts of the teaching. It does not treat every terrifying vision as an invading enemy. It suggests that fear can turn the contents of consciousness into a hostile world. Modern neuroscience offers a related but more limited point. Perception is not passive. The brain constantly interprets signals, predicts patterns, and gives emotional meaning to what appears. In dreams, fever states, delirium, trauma, and psychedelic experiences, internally generated imagery can feel external and powerful. The emotional brain can shape the scene, making it peaceful, threatening, familiar, or strange. When ordinary sensory correction is reduced, as it may be near death or in altered states, the line between perception and imagination can weaken. The Tibetan Bardo teaching places that problem at the center. It says that what appears after death may be mistaken for an outside world when it is deeply tied to the structure of the mind. The purpose of hearing the text read aloud to the dying or recently dead is also important. The reader guides consciousness through the intermediate state, reminding it not to fear the visions and not to cling to the familiar. The practice assumes that hearing may continue in some form after outward responsiveness has faded. Modern science cannot confirm that a dead person hears instructions in the way the tradition intends. It can say that hearing may be among the last senses to disappear in some dying patients, and that unresponsive people may still process sound under certain conditions before death is complete. This does not validate the full religious practice, but it gives the act a quiet biological relevance. Speaking calmly to the dying may matter even when no response is visible. The voice may provide orientation, reduce distress, or reach a mind that is no longer able to answer. In the Bardo tradition, the spoken words do more than comfort the living. They serve as final instruction in recognition. The dying person is reminded that fear, longing, and confusion can shape the path ahead. In psychological terms, this resembles a guide through an extreme altered state. In spiritual terms, it is a guide through the interval between one life and the next. A key difference between this tradition and many Western images of the afterlife is that the bardo is not meant to be permanent. It is transitional. The mind moves through experiences shaped by karma, a term that refers not simply to reward and punishment, but to the consequences of intention, action, and habit. In this framework, what continues after death is not an unchanged personality travelling intact forever. It is a stream of consciousness conditioned by patterns formed during life. The self, as ordinarily understood, is not treated as a fixed object. This is a difficult idea for many modern readers because personal identity is usually imagined as a stable inner owner of memories and traits. Buddhism challenges that assumption. It sees the person as a changing process, held together by causes, perceptions, feelings, and habits. Death does not preserve the ego as a finished possession. It exposes how unstable that ego has always been. Here the tradition intersects, cautiously, with modern cognitive science. The brain constructs a sense of self from memory, body signals, social experience, and ongoing prediction. That self feels continuous, but it is actively maintained. In dreams, dissociation, meditation, brain injury, and near-death states, the self-model can change or dissolve. The Bardo teaching takes this instability as a spiritual fact. Science treats it as a feature of neural organization. Both views resist the simple idea that the self is a solid thing hidden inside the body. The Tibetan map therefore shifts the question of what happens after death. It does not ask only where the dead go. It asks whether consciousness can recognize its own activity when all familiar supports are gone. This makes fear and attachment central. The frightening vision is not the final problem. The reaction to it is, the beautiful vision is not the final answer. Clinging to it can still bind the mind. This is a subtle model of dying because it does not make the afterlife merely comforting. It makes it a test of perception. What matters is whether experience is understood clearly or mistaken for something fixed. In calm scientific language, this can be restated without adopting the full metaphysics. At the edge of death, the mind may enter states where ordinary categories fail. Images, memories, emotions, and body sense may reorganize. A person's expectations and training may influence how that state is interpreted. A tradition that prepares people for death by teaching them not to fear inner experience may change the way dying is met. That alone is significant, even before any claim about what happens beyond measurable brain activity. The Tibetan Bardo remains beyond science in its final claims, because rebirth and liberation cannot be measured with an EEG or a brain scan. Yet it remains relevant to science because it preserves a careful account of transitional consciousness, altered perception, and the role of recognition under extreme conditions. It offers an afterlife map in which the deepest terrain is not a river, a gate, or a hall of judgment, but the mind encountering itself without the usual protections of the body. Across cultures that had little direct contact with one another, the afterlife is often described with a stable set of shapes. The names change, the gods change, the moral systems change, and the landscape changes with climate and history. Yet certain features keep returning. There is often a crossing from one condition to another. There is often a guide who knows the route. There is often a boundary that cannot be crossed twice. There are often meetings with the dead, tests of memory or character, and some form of transformation that makes the person no longer exactly what they were in life. These recurring structures do not prove that all traditions are reporting the same literal place. They do show that human beings, facing the same biological fact, have repeatedly organized death through similar patterns. The body stops, the living remain, the person seems absent and yet continues in memory, ritual, and hope. The mind tries to understand a disappearance that is absolute from the outside but difficult to accept from within. Out of that pressure come maps. Some maps are geographical, with rivers, roads, gates, fields, mountains, and halls. Others are psychological, with visions, judgments, fears, and recognitions. Others are theological, where the central issue is relationship with God, moral repair, or final resurrection. The details differ deeply, and it would flatten them to treat every tradition as saying the same thing. But the repeated pattern itself is worth studying, because it shows how consistently death has been imagined as a passage rather than a simple stop. In the Greek world, one of the strongest images was the river Styx, a boundary between the living and the dead. The dead required passage into Hades, and the ferryman Charon carried them across when the proper rites had been performed. The river gives death a visible edge. On one side a breath, speech, family, and the open air. On the other side is the condition of the dead, changed and difficult to return from. The crossing is not mainly about distance, it is about status. The person becomes someone who belongs to another order. Ancient Greek thought contained many variations, from shadowy existence in the underworld to more selective destinations for heroes or the blessed, but the act of crossing remained powerful. It gave families a reason to perform funerary rites carefully. The dead needed proper transition, and the living needed to know they had helped the transition occur. This is a common function of afterlife maps. They do not only describe what may happen to the dead, they guide the living in how to behave around death. A body must be buried, burned, washed, wrapped, watched, mourned, named, prayed over, or placed with objects. These acts create order at the moment when order has been broken. The crossing makes grief active. It gives the living something careful to do. In Norse traditions, the afterlife could take a different shape. The Hall of Valhalla, associated with Odin, is one of the most familiar images, but it was not the only destination for the dead. Some went to other halls or realms, and the fate of the dead was tied to status, manner of death, and mythic order. Valhalla reflected the values of a warrior culture: courage, loyalty, combat, feasting, and preparation for a final cosmic struggle. The afterlife here is not a quiet field or a court of moral balance. It is a continuation and intensification of the social world that mattered most to those who told the stories. This is another recurring pattern. The afterlife often preserves the values that a culture places at the center of a meaningful life. Egypt imagined fertile fields and restored order. Norse myth preserved honor, battle, and the bonds of a hall. Greek traditions preserve the boundary between the living world and the realm of shades. These models reveal as much about life as they do about death. They tell what a people feared losing and what they hoped might remain. They also show that continuation is rarely imagined as simple repetition. The dead are altered. They may become shades, ancestors, blessed beings, warriors in a divine hall, or souls awaiting judgment. Death transforms identity, but it does not erase relationship. The dead remain connected to the living through memory, ritual, obligation, and story. In many ancestral traditions, this continuing relationship is central. Ancestors may be understood as present in the land, in the household, in ritual, or in the ongoing moral life of a community. The afterlife is not always placed far away. It may be near, layered with the living world, accessible through ceremony, dream, and memory. From a scientific perspective, ancestral presence can be studied as a social and psychological reality, even when metaphysical claims remain outside measurement. Human beings carry the dead in language, behavior, genes, names, property, places, and learned ways of seeing the world. The dead influence decisions long after their bodies are gone. A ritual that speaks to ancestors may make a spiritual claim, but it also preserves social memory. It keeps continuity visible and prevents death from severing the person from the group all at once. Another repeated feature is the guide. Egypt has Anubis. Greece has Hermes in some roles, and Charon at the river. Many traditions include angels, ancestors, saints, animals, or divine messengers who help the dead move from one state to another. A guide appears because death is imagined as unfamiliar territory. The dead person cannot be expected to know the way alone. In near-death reports, people often describe being met by deceased relatives, luminous beings, or presences that offer reassurance or direction. A scientific account might understand these figures as memory and attachment systems becoming active under extreme stress. The brain may draw on familiar caregivers, religious imagery, and emotional expectations to create safety and orientation. A religious account may understand the same figures as real helpers. The structural point is that the guide reduces isolation. Death is frightening partly because it seems solitary. The guide answers that fear by making the transition accompanied. The human mind may be likely to form such images because social connection is central to survival and identity. From infancy onward, distress is regulated through the presence of others. At the edge of death, the appearance of a trusted figure may be one of the deepest forms of comfort the mind can generate, or one form through which a tradition understands grace. Boundaries also return again and again. There are rivers, gates, bridges, doors, mountains, narrow paths, scales, books, flames, and thresholds of light. A boundary gives shape to the point of no return. It marks the difference between temporary crisis and final death. Near-death survivors often describe reaching a limit and sensing that crossing it would mean not coming back. This image is medically interesting because many near-death experiences occur during states from which the person does return. The boundary may express the brain's attempt to represent danger and irreversible transition. It may also be shaped by cultural expectations about judgment, heaven, rebirth, or reunion. What matters is that human experience near death often seems to organize itself around a dividing line. The person approaches, pauses, is turned back, or moves on. Ancient maps place this line in the world beyond. Modern reports place it inside an experience. The similarity does not erase the difference, but it invites careful comparison. Human beings may need boundaries to make death thinkable. Without a boundary, death is only disappearance. With a boundary, it becomes a passage, and a passage can be prepared for, witnessed, and given meaning. The most delicate recurring feature is reunion. Many traditions imagine the dead joining ancestors, family, companions, saints, or a divine presence. Many near-death accounts include meetings with loved ones who have died. Again, the explanations diverge. In neuroscience, such encounters may arise from memory networks, attachment systems, and the brain's tendency to create social presence in dreams and altered states. In religion, they may be taken as evidence that relationship continues beyond bodily death. In grief, they often function as a promise that separation is not the final word. What is clear is that the idea of reunion answers one of death's most painful features. Death removes the person from ordinary contact. Reunion imagines contact restored under changed conditions. It is not only the self that people hope will continue, it is love, recognition, and relationship. This may be why afterlife traditions so often include not just survival, but being known. A nameless continuation would not satisfy the same need. The dead must remember or be remembered. They must be received by someone, recognized by someone, or restored to a larger order that gives their life coherence. Old maps of the afterlife are therefore not primitive attempts at science. They are organized responses to experiences that science also studies from another side: dying brains, near-death memories, grief, social attachment, moral self-review, and the body's return to matter. The maps cannot be combined into one simple answer. Their differences are real and sometimes irreconcilable, yet their repeated crossings, guides, boundaries, reunions, and transformations show that death presses on a common set of human concerns. Where is the person now? Who helps them? What must be faced? What remains of the life they lived? Whether these structures come from shared biology, shared emotional needs, spiritual insight, or some mixture that cannot yet be separated, they reveal that the afterlife has always been a way of asking what the human person is when the body no longer speaks. A body can be examined after death, a brain can be monitored as oxygen falls, the timing of cardiac arrest, the chemistry of cells, and the return of matter to the soil can all be studied with instruments. But the claim that something personal survives the failure of the body belongs to a different kind of question. It appears in religion, philosophy, ritual, and private experience. It is not one claim shared by all cultures, and it is not always described as an immortal inner object leaving the body. Different traditions imagine survival as resurrection, judgment, rebirth, ancestorhood, union with God, liberation from the cycle of lives, or continued existence in a spiritual realm. These claims cannot be confirmed or rejected by ordinary laboratory methods, yet they cannot be ignored in a serious account of death, because they show how human beings have tried to understand what remains when speech, movement, and memory disappear from the visible body. In Judaism, views of the afterlife have developed across time and are not limited to a single simple picture. Older texts often speak of Sheol, a shadowed condition of the dead, while later Jewish thought includes richer ideas of the world to come: resurrection, divine judgment, purification, and closeness to God. Some traditions emphasize moral accountability, others emphasize the restoration of life at the end of days. The important point is that the person is not always imagined as a detached soul escaping matter forever. In many Jewish teachings, the body and the created world remain meaningful, and resurrection is not merely symbolic. Death does not cancel the value of embodied life. It interrupts it, awaiting repair by divine action. This differs from models that treat the body as a prison and the soul as the only true self. It also shows why religious ideas about survival should be handled with care. Even within one tradition, the answer to what survives may include memory before God, moral record, communal identity, and future restoration, rather than one narrow image of a ghost-like self. Christianity inherits Jewish ideas of resurrection and judgment, then reshapes them around the death and resurrection of Jesus. In many Christian traditions, the hope after death is not only that the soul continues, but that the person is ultimately raised and transformed. Heaven is often understood as communion with God, not simply a pleasant extension of ordinary life. Hell is understood in different ways across Christian history, sometimes as separation from God, sometimes as punishment, sometimes as final refusal of divine life. Christian communities differ in how they describe the intermediate state between death and final resurrection. What stays central is the belief that the person is known by God and that death does not have the final authority over creation. In scientific terms, this claim cannot be reduced to brain survival. It depends on divine agency. The continuity of the person is not explained by neurons continuing to fire after death. because the doctrine does not require the brain to remain active. It claims that God can hold, restore, and transform personal identity beyond biological collapse. This places Christian hope outside ordinary physical explanation, but not outside human meaning. It answers the fear that love and moral history vanish when the body fails. Islam also places death within a clear moral and divine framework. The person dies, the body returns to the earth, and the soul enters an intermediate state often called barzakh, a barrier or interval before resurrection and final judgment. The Day of Judgment is central. Leaves are weighed by God's knowledge and justice. Deeds are accounted for. Mercy is essential, and the final outcomes are paradise or punishment, like Christianity and Judaism. Islam does not treat death as the natural fading of a private consciousness into nothing. Death is a passage into accountability before the Creator. The body matters, resurrection matters, and the life lived in the world matters. The soul is not independent in the sense of being self-sufficient. It belongs to God and remains under divine knowledge. Here again, the structure resembles some near-death themes at a broad-level review: judgment, consequence, and transition. But the resemblance should not be overstated. Religious judgment is not simply a neurological life review. It is a theological event grounded in God's justice and mercy. Science may study why human beings experience moral review near death. It cannot decide whether divine judgment exists. The two kinds of explanation operate at different levels. In Hindu traditions, death is often understood through the ideas of Atman, karma, samsara, and moksha. Though Hindu thought is broad and internally diverse, Atman can refer to the deepest self, sometimes understood as identical with ultimate reality in some schools and as distinct yet dependent on the divine in others. Karma refers to the consequences of action, not as simple reward and punishment, but as a law of moral causation that shapes future experience. Samsara is the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. Moksha is liberation from that cycle. In this framework, what survives death is not merely personality as remembered by family. Some continuity carries the results of action and attachment into future birth. The ordinary ego may change, names and bodies may change, but the deeper principle or stream of continuity remains involved in a larger process. This model answers death by widening the time scale. One life is not the whole story, yet continuation is not automatically freedom. Rebirth can mean further entanglement, further suffering, and further ignorance. The highest aim is not endless repetition of personal life, but release from the conditions that make repeated birth necessary. Buddhist traditions share the language of rebirth in many forms, but often reject the idea of a permanent, unchanging soul. This is a crucial difference. The doctrine of no fixed self does not mean that nothing matters after death. It means that what continues is a causal stream, shaped by craving, intention, perception, and action, rather than a stable inner owner. Continuity does not require sameness. One moment gives rise to the next without a permanent object passing unchanged through all of them. In death, the ordinary pattern of body-based identity ends, but the consequences of mental and moral habits may continue into new becoming. Liberation is the ending of this cycle through insight. This differs sharply from traditions that hope for an eternal personal self. It also intersects cautiously with modern cognitive science, which increasingly understands the self as constructed, dynamic, and dependent on changing processes in the brain and body. That scientific view does not prove Buddhist metaphysics. It simply makes the Buddhist suspicion of a solid self easier to understand in modern terms. Other traditions place the dead within the continuing life of the community and the land. Ancestor veneration, In many African, East Asian, indigenous, and other cultural systems does not always separate religion, family, ecology, and memory into distinct categories. The dead may remain present as ancestors who guide, protect, warn, or require ritual attention. Their survival is relational. A person continues not only because an inner essence persists, but because bonds remain active between the living and the dead. Offerings, names, shrines, graves, stories, and seasonal rites maintain these bonds. From a scientific viewpoint, such practices preserve memory, stabilize grief, and carry social knowledge across generations. From within the traditions themselves, they may also maintain real communication with those who have entered another mode of existence. One description gives social function, the other gives sacred meaning. Both reveal that death is rarely treated as a private event. It changes the whole network of relationships around the person. The study of religious afterlife beliefs therefore requires humility. Science is powerful where a claim can be observed, measured, repeated, and tested. It can ask whether near-death experiences correlate with brain activity, whether terminal lucidity has measurable markers, whether the dying brain releases specific chemicals, and how cultural expectations shape reports. It cannot weigh a soul, detect paradise with a telescope, or prove resurrection by scanning a corpse. This limit does not make science weak. It defines its method. Religious traditions also have limits when they speak about biology. A doctrine of the soul does not determine how long neurons survive without oxygen, how muscle stiffening develops, or how memory depends on the hippocampus. Confusion begins when either side tries to answer every question with only one kind of language. Death has biological facts, psychological experiences, cultural patterns, and metaphysical claims. A careful account keeps these layers distinct without forcing them apart completely. The question of the soul remains because human identity is not experienced as a collection of tissues from the inside. A person feels like a center of awareness, memory, responsibility, and relationship. When the body dies, it is natural to ask whether that center has ended, moved, been judged, dissolved, or been held by something larger than the body. The religions of the world answer differently, sometimes in ways that cannot be reconciled, yet they share a refusal to treat death as only a mechanical failure. They insist that a life has meaning beyond its last heartbeat. Science cannot confirm that insistence as fact. It can show why the insistence arises, why it is emotionally and socially powerful, and why reports from the edge of death keep the question alive. Between neurons and theology, between memory and judgment, between the body that returns to matter and the self that seems to look out through it, the question of the soul remains open, not because evidence has been ignored, but because different kinds of evidence reach different edges. Consciousness is the part of death that cannot be placed on a scale or held in a tissue sample. The brain can be weighed, cooled, scanned, injured, stimulated, and examined under a microscope, but the felt presence of experience is known most directly from within. A person sees light, hears a voice, remembers a childhood room, feels pain, or recognizes a face, and each event has a private quality that does not appear in the same way to an outside observer. Neuroscience begins from the outside. It measures blood flow, electrical activity, chemical signaling, and the behavior that follows. From this work, a strong and practical conclusion has emerged. Ordinary human consciousness depends closely on the living brain. When specific brain regions are damaged, specific abilities can change or disappear. Injury to language areas can remove speech while leaving intelligence partly intact. Damage to memory systems can prevent new memories from forming. disruption of visual cortex can remove conscious sight even when the eyes remain healthy. Anesthesia can turn awareness off in a controlled medical setting, then allow it to return when the drugs are removed. Sleep, seizures, coma, dementia, delirium, psychedelic states, and brain stimulation all show that changes in neural activity can change the contents and level of consciousness. This evidence is not minor. It is the foundation of modern neurology. It explains why the brain is treated as the organ most directly involved in experience, identity, and selfhood. Yet the same evidence does not fully solve what consciousness is. It shows that the brain is necessary for ordinary awareness, but it does not explain why neural activity should feel like anything from the inside. This is often called the hard problem of consciousness. A brain can process information, compare signals, guide movement, and store memory. Those functions can be described in physical terms. The harder question is why any of that processing is accompanied by subjective experience. Why does the wavelength of light become the experience of blue? Why does injury become pain? Why does memory feel like the return of a lived moment instead of a silent data retrieval? These questions are not about whether the brain is involved. It clearly is. They're about the gap between mechanism and experience. Many scientists think the gap will narrow as neuroscience improves. On this view, consciousness is not a separate substance or signal. It is what certain organized brain processes do when they reach enough integration, complexity, and self-modeling. The mind is produced by the brain in roughly the way digestion is produced by the digestive system, or circulation by the heart and vessels. Though consciousness is far more difficult to describe because it is private and distributed. Several theories attempt to explain how this production might work. Some emphasize global availability, the idea that information becomes conscious when it is broadcast across many brain networks and made available for memory, decision, attention, and report. Others emphasize integration, the idea that conscious experience depends on how strongly and irreducibly information is combined within a system. Others focus on prediction, suggesting that the brain constantly builds models of the body and world, and consciousness arises from the controlled updating of those models. These theories differ, but they share a basic commitment. Consciousness is not somewhere else using the brain. It is an activity of the brain itself. The strength of this approach is that it fits much of the evidence. When neural networks are altered, experience changes. When the brain is damaged enough, the person no longer wakes, speaks, remembers, or responds. When brain death occurs, there is no reliable evidence that the person continues to interact with the world through the body. The production model is therefore cautious, testable, and medically useful. It also explains why near-death experiences can be studied without assuming that consciousness has left the body. A brain under oxygen stress, chemical disturbance, and partial recovery may create unusual states that feel separate from the body while still depending on brain activity. The weakness of the production model is not that it lacks evidence. Its weakness is that evidence for dependence is not the same as a complete explanation of subjectivity. A damaged radio cannot play music, but that does not prove the radio created the music. This comparison is often used by people who favor receiver or filter models of consciousness. In such models, the brain does not produce consciousness entirely. It limits, shapes, receives, or localizes a wider field of mind. Damage to the brain then disrupts expression rather than proving that consciousness itself has been destroyed. Terminal lucidity is sometimes used in this discussion because it appears to show personal clarity returning when the brain seems too damaged to support it. Near-death reports are also used because some survivors describe awareness when ordinary physiology predicts little or none. These cases do not prove the receiver model. They only provide reasons some researchers and philosophers remain dissatisfied with a purely productive account. The receiver model has its own difficulties. It is hard to test. It often lacks a clear mechanism. If consciousness exists beyond the brain, science must ask how it interacts with neurons, why specific brain injuries produce specific changes, why anesthesia works so reliably, and why personality can change with disease. A broad claim that the brain receives mind can become too flexible, explaining everything after the fact while predicting little in advance. For this reason, most neuroscience remains grounded in the production model, because it offers clearer experiments. Still, the receiver idea persists because the mystery of experience is not closed. Some historical thinkers propose that the brain may filter a larger consciousness down into the narrow form needed for ordinary life. In this view, normal awareness is restricted because survival requires selection. A living person cannot attend to every memory, sensation, and possibility at once. The brain filters reality so the organism can act. Near death, during psychedelics, in deep meditation, or under certain brain disruptions, the filter may loosen. Experience may then feel expanded, timeless, or less centered on the body. This idea remains speculative, but it has a careful version that does not require rejecting neuroscience. The brain may produce the ordinary structure of self while also limiting the range of what can be experienced. Whether anything exists beyond that limit is a separate question. The filter model becomes most interesting when placed beside disinhibition in the dying brain. Inhibition is one of the brain's essential control systems. It prevents runaway activity, separates relevant signals from irrelevant ones, and keeps perception stable. If inhibition weakens near death, stored memories, emotional networks, visual imagery, and body maps may become unusually active together. From the inside, this could feel like a wider field of awareness. It could feel like leaving the body, reviewing a life, meeting presences, or entering a space not built from ordinary perception. A production model can explain this as the brain generating an altered state. A filter model can interpret it as the brain no longer restricting consciousness in the usual way. The same event can therefore be read in two ways. The data needed to decide between them are difficult to obtain, because the deepest question lies at the edge of measurability. If a person returns from cardiac arrest, science can study the report and the medical record. If a person does not return, there is no report. If brain death is complete and irreversible, current medicine finds no evidence of continuing embodied consciousness. What cannot be measured is whether subjective awareness exists without any possible channel back into behavior, speech, or brain activity. A claim with no possible observation is not easily part of science. This does not make it false. It means the tools of science cannot yet hold it. The debate over consciousness and the brain therefore requires two forms of honesty. The first is that mental life is deeply dependent on the brain in every ordinary case science can study. The second is that dependence has not become a full explanation of why experience exists at all. Death sharpens both truths. As the brain fails, the person's ability to communicate, remember, move, and wake normally disappears. At the same time, unusual reports from near-death and terminal lucidity suggest that the final states of mind may be more complex than simple fading. The safest conclusion is not that consciousness certainly ends with the brain, and not that it certainly survives without it. The safest conclusion is that the brain is the known condition for human consciousness. While the ultimate nature of consciousness remains unsettled, that unsettled space is where philosophy, religion, and speculative physics continue to enter. The next question is whether the deeper structure of the physical world has anything to say about mind, or whether attempts to connect consciousness with quantum theory only move the mystery into smaller and harder to see places. Quantum theory enters the question of death because consciousness remains difficult to place inside an ordinary mechanical picture of the brain. This does not mean that every mystery of the mind requires quantum physics, and it does not mean that the language of quantum mechanics can be used freely to support any idea about the soul. Quantum theory is one of the most successful scientific frameworks ever developed, but it is also one of the most misunderstood. It describes the behavior of matter and energy at very small scales, where particles can exist in states that do not match common experience, where measurement affects what can be known, and where probabilities replace simple certainty. These features are strange enough on their own. When they are joined too quickly to consciousness, the result often becomes vague. Words such as energy, frequency, vibration, and entanglement can be used in ways that sound scientific without making testable claims. A careful documentary account has to slow down here. This serious question is not whether quantum theory sounds mysterious in the same way consciousness sounds mysterious. The serious question is whether processes at the quantum level are actually needed to explain how awareness arises, how the brain works, or whether anything about mind could continue after the body dies. Most neuroscience does not require this step. Neurons are large biological cells. They communicate through electrical impulses, chemical messengers, and changing connections. These processes can be described successfully with ordinary biochemistry and physiology. When a person sees, remembers, speaks, sleeps, wakes, or falls under anesthesia. Many of the changes can be tracked through networks of neurons and molecules acting at scales much larger than atoms. This is one reason many scientists are cautious about quantum consciousness theories. The brain is warm, wet, and noisy. Delicate quantum states are usually thought to lose coherence quickly in such environments. Coherence means that a quantum system maintains the fragile relationships that allow its unusual properties to matter. In many biological settings, those relationships are disrupted almost immediately by surrounding heat and molecular motion. If a theory claims that consciousness depends on long-lasting quantum effects in the brain, it must explain how those effects survive long enough and influence neural activity strongly enough to matter. Without that, the theory remains an interesting idea rather than a working explanation. The best-known serious proposal connecting quantum theory to consciousness is associated with Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff. Penrose, a mathematical physicist, argued that human understanding may involve something not fully captured by conventional computation. Hameroff, an anesthesiologist, focused on microtubules, tiny structures inside cells that help maintain shape, transport materials, and organize internal activity. Together they developed a theory often called orchestrated objective reduction. The name is technical, but the basic idea can be stated more simply. They suggest that consciousness may arise from quantum processes inside microtubules in neurons, and that these processes collapse into definite moments of experience through a physical mechanism tied to the structure of space-time itself. In this view, consciousness is not merely a byproduct of ordinary neural computation. It is linked, at least partly, to deeper physical events. The proposal is ambitious because it tries to connect mind, brain, quantum mechanics, and gravity. It is also controversial because each connection is difficult to demonstrate. Critics argue that there is not enough evidence that microtubules maintain the required quantum states in the living brain, or that such states produce conscious experience. Supporters argue that biology may use quantum effects more often than older assumptions allowed, and that microtubules deserve closer study. The existence of quantum effects in biology is not impossible. Photosynthesis, bird navigation, enzyme activity, and other biological processes have been discussed in relation to quantum behavior, but showing that quantum effects help a plant transfer energy, or help a bird sense magnetic direction is not the same as showing that consciousness depends on quantum collapse. Each claim has to be tested on its own. This distinction is essential. Quantum biology is a legitimate field. Quantum consciousness is a more speculative area within a much harder problem. The fact that life can use quantum effects in certain cases does not automatically mean the mind is quantum in the deeper sense proposed by Penrose and Hameroff. It only keeps the door from being closed too quickly. The brain may contain small-scale physical processes that matter in ways not yet fully understood, but the burden of proof remains high, because ordinary neuroscience already explains a great deal about how experience changes when the brain changes. One reason the Penrose and Hameroff theory attracts attention in discussions of death is that it seems to offer a way for consciousness to be more fundamental than brain activity alone. If conscious moments are related to basic features of space-time, then the mind might not be fully confined to the firing of neurons. Hameroff has sometimes suggested that information connected with consciousness could, at death, disperse into the wider universe rather than simply vanish. This idea is often repeated in popular culture as if it were a scientific conclusion. It is not. It is a speculative interpretation built on a disputed theory. There is no direct evidence that a person's memories, identity, or awareness leave the dying brain as quantum information and remain conscious elsewhere. Quantum information in physics is not the same as personal memory, character, or subjective life. A pattern being physically conserved in some form would not automatically mean that the person continues to experience. The difference is important because it protects the discussion from false comfort. A human life is not just information in the abstract. It is organized memory, bodily feeling, relationships, language, emotion, and a continuing point of view. Any theory of survival after death must explain how that organization remains unified when the brain that maintained it has stopped functioning. Quantum speculation does not currently provide that explanation. Still, it raises a question that cannot be dismissed only because it is difficult. If consciousness is not yet fully explained by brain mechanisms, and if the physical world is deeper and less intuitive than ordinary experience suggests, then the final account of mind may require ideas that are not yet part of standard neuroscience. That possibility should be held carefully, not inflated. Science has often advanced when a strange fact forced a change in framework. It has also often been misled when mystery was mistaken for evidence. The dying brain, near-death experience, terminal lucidity, and the hard problem of consciousness are strange enough without adding claims that cannot be tested. The responsible path is to separate levels. At one level, the brain clearly supports human consciousness during life. At another level, the ultimate nature of consciousness remains philosophically unsettled. At a still deeper level, physics shows that matter is not the simple solid substance it appears to be in everyday life. These levels may someday connect in a clear theory. For now, they mostly sit beside one another. The danger is to turn their proximity into proof. The value is to let each one sharpen the question. Death forces the issue because it removes the brain from ordinary function. If consciousness is produced entirely by the brain, then the irreversible loss of brain function ends the person's experience. If consciousness is more fundamental, filtered, received, or partly rooted in deeper physics, then death may be a change in the way consciousness is organized rather than a simple extinction. Current science does not have enough evidence to choose the second claim. It does have enough evidence to show why the first claim is powerful and why some thinkers still regard it as incomplete. Quantum theories of consciousness therefore occupy a narrow and uncertain place. They should not be treated as proof of an afterlife. They should not be dismissed as meaningless simply because weak versions are common. The serious versions ask whether the known machinery of neurons is the whole story or whether the physical basis of awareness reaches further down into nature, the answer remains unsettled. What can be said with confidence is that death exposes the limits of every simple model. The body returns to matter. The brain changes before it falls silent. Some people report structured awareness close to cardiac arrest. Some damaged minds become briefly clear before the end. Religions describe survival, judgment, rebirth, or liberation. Physics reveals a world whose foundation is not easy to picture. None of these facts alone proves that consciousness survives death. Together, they leave the question open in a disciplined way. The mystery is not a license to believe anything. It is a reason to keep the categories precise, to separate evidence from hope, and to admit that the final nature of awareness may reach beyond the explanations currently available, even while every measurable human mind remains deeply tied to the living brain. The most careful answer to what happens after death begins by separating what is known from what remains uncertain. Biology can describe the failure of circulation, the loss of oxygen, the changing chemistry of cells, and the gradual return of the body to the environment. Neuroscience can show that the brain does not always become silent at the first moment of cardiac arrest, and that some dying brains pass through short periods of organized electrical activity. Psychology can study the memories reported by people who return from the edge of death, including calmness, separation from the body, life review, and encounters that feel deeply meaningful. Medical research can document rare episodes of terminal lucidity, when people with severe dementia briefly recover speech, recognition, or emotional clarity before dying. Anthropology and history can compare the maps of the afterlife created by cultures across the world, from judgment scenes to rebirth cycles, from ancestor traditions to ideas of resurrection and liberation. Physics can remind us that matter itself is stranger and more layered than ordinary experience suggests, while also warning that strangeness is not evidence by itself. These fields do not collapse into one answer. They create a boundary of knowledge with different edges. At one edge, death is a measurable process. At another, it is an experience reported by those who came close but returned. At another, it is a religious and philosophical question about the survival of the person. At the deepest edge, it is a problem about consciousness, because no account of death can be complete until the nature of awareness is better understood. The measurable process is the clearest. When the heart stops, blood no longer delivers oxygen in the usual way. The brain is placed under severe stress, and without restored circulation, its cells lose the energy required to maintain life. Over time, the body cools, blood settles, muscles stiffen and then relax, cells break down, microbes spread, and matter is returned to surrounding systems. This part of death is not symbolic. It is chemical and physical. It is also uneven. Different cells fail at different rates, and medical intervention can sometimes reverse states that once seemed final. This is why modern medicine distinguishes cardiac arrest, clinical death, and brain death. The words matter because they prevent confusion. A stopped heart is not the same as irreversible loss of all brain function. A flat line in one measurement is not the same as the end of every biological process. Death is not made less real by being gradual. It is made more precise. The human body does not cross from life to non-life in one uniform instant. It passes through a sequence, and science has become better at observing that sequence. The brain remains the most difficult part of that sequence because it is the organ through which experience is expressed. Electrical recordings near death have shown that, in some cases, activity associated with conscious processing can appear around the time circulation fails. The strongest interpretation is not that consciousness has been proved to survive death. It is that the old assumption of immediate inner blankness is too simple. A dying brain may briefly activate networks involved in memory, perception, and the sense of self. It may enter a state unlike ordinary waking life, ordinary sleep, or ordinary coma. Low oxygen, chemical stress, disinhibition, and changing network connectivity could combine to produce vivid experience. This may help explain why near-death reports often include light, movement, review, peace, and separation from the body. It may also help explain why some of these reports feel more coherent than expected. Yet the evidence has limits. Brain activity does not reveal content by itself. A wave pattern cannot say what a person saw or whether anyone was aware. A survivor's memory cannot always be timed with precision. Experience may occur just before loss of consciousness, during partial resuscitation, or during recovery. The science is strong enough to challenge simple dismissal, but not strong enough to settle the meaning. Near-death experiences sit exactly in this difficult zone. They are real as reports, often life-changing, and sometimes described with unusual clarity. Some include details that appear to match events in the medical environment, which makes them especially important to study. But the explanations remain contested. The brain may continue limited processing under conditions that are outwardly unresponsive. Hearing may persist. Cardiopulmonary resuscitation may provide partial blood flow. Memory may reconstruct the timing of events after the fact. Cultural expectations may influence how the experience is understood. None of these possibilities explains every case easily, and none proves that consciousness left the body. The most honest conclusion is that awareness near death is not fully understood. It may be produced by the brain in crisis. It may involve processes that current tools miss. It may include errors, accurate perceptions, and profound inner imagery within the same broad class of experience. A single explanation may not cover all cases. The same restraint applies to terminal lucidity. When a person with severe dementia suddenly recognizes family or speaks clearly near death, the event can feel as if the self has returned from somewhere hidden. Biology may eventually explain this through surviving networks, altered inhibition, changes in inflammation, temporary shifts in proteins, or emergency neurochemistry. It may turn out that many memories were inaccessible rather than erased, and that the final phase of dying briefly changes the conditions for access. That would be an extraordinary neurological discovery without requiring the conclusion that the mind exists apart from the brain. At the same time, terminal lucidity keeps pressure on any model that treats damaged function as simple disappearance. It suggests that the relationship between neural damage and personal presence may be more subtle than behavior alone reveals. A person who cannot respond may not be entirely absent in the way observers assume. This possibility matters ethically as well as scientifically. It supports gentler care, continued speech, and respect for patients who seem unreachable. The cultural and religious maps of death add a different kind of evidence. They do not function like laboratory results, but they preserve patterns of human attention. Again and again, people imagine death as a passage, a review, a judgment, a release, a return, or a transformation. These patterns may arise from shared features of the brain and the emotional demands of grief. They may also reflect experiences from dreams, illness, ritual, and near-death states that were interpreted through sacred language. Their similarity does not prove a common afterlife. Their difference does not make them meaningless. They show that human beings have rarely been satisfied with the idea that death is only mechanical failure. They have asked whether actions matter beyond the moment, whether relationships can continue, whether the dead are known, and whether the self has a deeper basis than the body. Science can explain some reasons those questions arise. It cannot remove the questions by explaining their origin. Consciousness is the point where every answer becomes less secure. The dependence of mind on brain is supported by enormous evidence. Injury, anesthesia, sleep, disease, and stimulation all show that changing the brain changes experience. This makes it reasonable to think that the irreversible death of the brain ends the ordinary human mind. Yet the existence of subjective experience has not been fully explained. The inner fact of awareness remains difficult to derive from physical description alone. That gap does not prove survival. It does keep the final philosophical question open. If consciousness is produced entirely by the brain, death is the end of experience. If consciousness is in some way more fundamental, filtered by the brain, or connected to deeper features of nature, then death may be a change whose full meaning is not yet measurable. Current science favours the first view in practice because it is testable and fits much of the evidence. It cannot completely close the second because the nature of awareness itself remains unsettled. What remains, then, is not a dramatic conclusion but a disciplined uncertainty. Death is biological because the body fails through observable processes. It is psychological because the mind may generate powerful experiences near the edge of life. It is cultural because every society gives the dead a place in memory and meaning. It is philosophical because the self is not easily reduced to what can be seen from outside. It is cosmic in the quiet sense that the matter of the body returns to a universe that existed before it and continues after it. The strange science of death does not show that one tradition was right, that one molecule explains everything, or that one theory of consciousness has solved the problem. It shows that dying is more active, more layered, and less completely understood than the simplest models once suggested. The body returns, the brain may flare before silence, memory may gather, clarity may briefly reappear, cultures may give the passage names and forms. Beyond that, there is an edge where evidence becomes thin and interpretation begins. A careful mind does not need to fill that edge with certainty. It can leave it open, not as emptiness, but as the remaining question at the centre of being alive: how matter becomes experience, how experience becomes a person, and what, if anything, remains when the living structure can no longer hold it. The subject settles at the edge of what can be measured and what can only be approached with care. The body follows chemistry, cells lose their order, tissues return to the earth, and the atoms that once carried breath, memory, and movement enter other forms of matter. The brain, so closely tied to every known moment of human awareness, may not end in a single instant, but pass through brief and unusual states as oxygen fades and its networks struggle to maintain coherence. Some people return from that edge with memories that feel more ordered than science once expected. Some damaged minds become clear for a final moment, as if identity had been hidden behind a failing system, rather than erased completely. Around these facts, cultures have built maps of passage, judgment, rebirth, reunion, and release, each one trying to give shape to the same quiet uncertainty. None of this proves that consciousness survives death. None of it proves that it does not. It only shows that death is not a simple subject, and that the last boundary of life reaches into biology, memory, relationship, belief, and the unresolved nature of awareness itself. The strongest science remains careful. It measures what can be measured. It avoids claiming more than the evidence allows, yet it also leaves room for humility, because the mind studying death is still a mind that does not fully understand itself. In that humility, the question becomes less harsh. The body returns to the world, the life leaves traces in others, the final state of awareness remains partly hidden. What continues, what ends, and what may change beyond recognition remain open at the quiet edge where knowledge pauses, and the mystery of being alive comes gently to rest.